So the first thing I want to discuss in detail is assessing what colors are available in the raw image. So here we're going to be working on this image of Jessie. Her tag is Jessie Page, and we're going to be assessing what colors are available here for us to use and what harmonies might be easy to move to from here. We're also going to figure out whether we want to work with a hue-based tool or a luma-based tool based on what's available. The first thing I'm going to do is actually just drop a JPEG version of this into the Adobe Color platform. To do this, I'm going to go to color.adobe.com, then hit Extract Theme, and then drag and drop in my JPEG export of the uncolored image. Next, my objective is to use these markers to mark as many different hues as possible, and also find the most saturated versions of those colors so they're easiest for us to see on the color wheel. So I'm going to keep one of these oranges, but move the other one. We don't have any green included yet, so I'm going to try to find a saturated green. Might be one in here somewhere. That's probably good enough for us to see, the direction of the color on the color wheel. And we have an orange, we have a blue. Let's see if we can get a more saturated blue maybe. Up here we also have blue. This is kind of gray. The color that we're missing is this weird lilac that's on some flowers in between. So I'm going to try to track down a saturated purple. Here's one. It's kind of difficult to catch these pixels sometimes. Okay, so these are all the hues available in the image, and then we have some in between, some that are sort of between orange and yellow, but this should cover the large range of things. And usually I don't include skin tone in this. So then we'll head over to the color wheel and it'll distribute those hues for us. Now we can assess what is going on, and I'm going to switch to HSB. Okay, let's see. So this is quite chaotic. We have colors all over the place. And of course, we're going to try to consolidate these colors into some sort of a harmony. We do have a couple of options here, so I'm going to go ahead and create 3 different sets of color just to show you how we could go to different harmonies from here. The first thing that I'm going to try to go to is something triadic, and we'll kind of see what's close. So I think maybe we can bring these blues to some sort of a purple or magenta. We can maintain this orange, and then we can sort of consolidate these greens. I also like messing around with these sliders just to see how different values in saturation and brightness will sort of affect this harmony. And so it's kind of nice to see that if we have a couple of more deep and maybe less saturated greens, they will go fairly well with a strong orange and maybe some sort of lilac purple. Okay, so this is the first harmony I'm going to aim for. Just to recap, we had some yellows and greens. They're going to be consolidated to greens. The oranges are going to kind of stay around orange. And any blues will be brought towards purple, so kind of between magenta and blue. Okay, so back in Photoshop, what is the best tool for us to tackle this with? Well, since we have a lot of different hues that we're trying to consolidate here, I'm going to go ahead and use a hue input-based tool. So in this case, I'm going to run with a selective color layer, and I'm going to see if I can do the entire triadic palette in just one selective color layer. Hue input-based tools are best when trying to consolidate many hues into a consolidated palette. And I would say Luma-based tools are a little bit better when there's not a lot of color available in the image and we're trying to inject color into the shadows, midtones, and highlights. Okay, let's get started. Usually I like to either go from the top or the bottom. Today I'll start with the magentas. So the magentas are going to mostly affect these purple flowers, so all we're going to do here is just move them a little bit closer to blue. So between red and cyan, we want to go more in the direction of cyan. Between saturating the magenta and desaturating it, we definitely want to saturate it. And then we can either go yellow or blue with it, and we're going to push towards blue. Okay, so far so good. That's barely made any change because we really only have a couple of tiny magenta pixels in here, but they are now a little bit more blue. Next, we can work with the blues, and they can either be pushed in the direction of cyan or towards red, which means, a little bit more into the purple range. So we're going to go slightly red on that. then add in a lot of magenta, and also we can saturate the blue by adding more blue. Okay, so far so good. We've just pushed the blue slightly less cyan, a little bit more red. Next up, we're gonna go into the cyans and kind of do the same thing. Let's go ahead and add in some magenta. We wanna move away from green and towards magenta. So that's becoming more purple. And then we're also going to add blue and remove yellow. That's gonna go to the left there. And then our final slider is just gonna let us determine whether we want to saturate the cyan or add some red instead. And as you see, that's gonna be the final pivot that really moves it into sort of the lilac direction. And then the last thing I'm gonna do to finalize these blues is just that I wanna move around this black a little bit, and that kind of helps tint more of the midtones and the highlights in the dress. So I'm actually gonna bring that just all the way to 100 and maybe bring the blues all the way to 100 as well. So that just kind of deepens that color. Okay, so far so good. We've consolidated the magentas, the blues, and the cyans all into this sort of purple lilac color. Next up, we're gonna work on the greens. And since those were a little bit too yellow, we're gonna bring them closer to cyan. So let's add some cyan and then maybe add some blue. We can kind of see that by shuffling it around, gives it really nice undertone. Lastly, we can also go ahead and desaturate the green by bringing in its opposite, magenta. That's very, very loud. We don't want another dominant color like that because we kind of have this lilac currently dominating the image. So instead, just bring that all the way over there, and that sort of mutes it into that darker green that we were looking at earlier. Lastly, we can shuffle around this black, maybe mute that green a little bit more, and that looks good. So far, so good. So lastly, I want to take a look at the yellows and the reds. And this orange that we're trying to maintain is going to sit mostly in the yellows. I think that's all good, but we don't want it to push too far into the red channel. So we're going to just bring the reds back towards the yellows and consolidate them kind of in the orange range. So to do that, we're going to add some yellow to the reds. Kind of bring that all the way up here. And then we can also push that even more yellow by adding some green. If we brought it all the way, it would go all the way into yellow. And we'll just go kind of halfway. Lastly, we can resaturate that a little bit just by adding some more red. I feel like we've lost some color, so maybe just something subtle. Okay, so here's the current before and after. And you'll kind of notice that we have affected her skin tone and her hair. I parked a mask down here, so we're gonna be using that. I've just made this mask to exclude her skin and her hair basically, so I'll bring that up here. And now her hair and her skin is no longer affected. I do think that generally when we apply drastic color like this, it's best to bring a little bit of that color onto the skin at low opacity. So the way to do that is bring down the mask density, and I'll bring it down to maybe about 80%. That way the skin doesn't just stand out in the middle of the color, but it kind of blends in and feathers in a little bit. All right, the last thing I want to do before wrapping up this color is just add a little bit of a black and a white tint. So we'll go into the blacks, and our color choices are basically purple, green, and orange. So intuitively, I'm gonna say I wanna go for purple. Just add some magenta, and we're gonna need a little bit of blue so that we're not too pink on that. So maybe add some blue like that. That's a little intense now. It's a little too blue. So to compensate, we can also add some red. Okay, that's some purple shadow right there. Really adds a lot of depth. We could tint the whites. We can probably tint them, either green or orange. I don't think orange is gonna look good. It's gonna look something kind of like that. It's very unnatural. We could go for some green. Something like that also looks very unnatural. I feel like this color is already very extreme and stylized, so I'm actually just going to leave the whites untinted for this one. Okay, so that's the final color. I'm gonna close this up and export it as a JPEG, and then we can assess how we did via the color wheel. Okay, back in Adobe Color, I'm now gonna drag and drop in our export, And then I'm just going to make sure that we have one of each hue selected. So let's try to find a green somewhere in here, maybe something like that, that's fine. And another green. We also have an orange, that's fine. And then I'm just gonna go for 2 purples. Okay, so now in the color wheel, we can see where those hues line up. And if they're a little bit difficult to see in terms of the distribution, we can just go to HSB and bump up the saturation, not the brightness or the hue, just the saturation. That'll just pull them further out on the color wheel and just make them a little bit easier to see in terms of the harmony. So now we can see we have an almost perfect triadic palette. And of course, there will be outliers here and there, right? We have a couple of hues that don't really belong, probably have some yellows that stand out a little bit, maybe some green hues that don't quite fit in with the other greens, but that's okay. I think we did really well for just using one selective color layer and putting all of this together in a couple of minutes. Let's go ahead and try a different color palette. Okay, here we are again with the original image and the original color wheel. Now, just to recap, we definitely want to find another harmony that's very easily accessible from what we already have in the image. So we could perhaps try to consolidate these hues over here in the blue range instead of the purple range. And then we can see if we want to consolidate these greens either also towards blues or towards the warm side. And that would give us somewhat of a double split complementary. So we could generally try to aim for cool and warm hues. Let's try to implement that. I'm going to pull up another selective color layer. And once again, I'm going to start with the magentas. The cyans, blues, and purples, so including the magentas, are going to be consolidated to blues. So let's see how far we can shift the magentas towards the blues. Okay, again, we won't really see much here because there's only tiny amounts of magenta in this image. Next up, let's go into the blues. There's not a lot of blue in this image, it's really just a little bit of those shadows, but generally I would say let's try to shift them a little bit more cyan. Let's take a look at the cyans. First up, let's see if we can darken the cyan a little bit just to bring a little bit more depth into those mids and highlights, so maybe somewhere around here. We can also go ahead and saturate the cyans by adding more cyan, and we could also add some blue. To compensate for that, because now we're pushing them too far towards blue, we can add some green. Green plus blue equals cyan. So right around there. Now we have much more of an accent color here. Next up, let's take a look at the greens. We're going to try to shift these as far towards blue as possible. So we're going to go all the way on the blue and all the way on the cyan. I want to eliminate as much of that green feeling as possible, so I'm going to go fully desaturated by adding full magenta. Let's take a look. So far, so good. Our greens are a little bit more blue. Okay, let's move on to the yellows. Now the yellows are a little bit tricky because this is where most of the flowers and some of the greens sit. So we can either, try to push these towards blue, or we can try to push these towards red, but we have to go in one direction or another. We're kind of halfway between them. I'm going to go ahead and try to shift the yellows towards blue while shifting the reds more towards red. First, I'm going to go towards blue. I don't want to go all the way because then all these flowers are going to be tinted, so I'll just kind of go halfway on adding blue. Also add some cyan. And lastly, I'm going to try to take out some of that green by just desaturating the green, adding magenta. Okay, now we do really have some red here as a result of that. So again, we can kind of try to compensate for that because our split complementary doesn't call for red, it calls for orange. Go into the reds and regulate that. First off, let's take out some of that magenta, move closer to orange. And then we can also add a little bit of yellow to saturate that orange more, so that looks a little bit more lively. Can also brighten it up a little bit with the whites. And lastly, up here we can either desaturate the flowers, but I don't really like that, or add some extra red and make them more of a rich orange, so that's nice. Let's do that. As we've now messed pretty heavily with both the yellows and the reds, I'm also going to steal this mask, just so that we don't affect the skin tone. And again, this is an 80% density mask, so it will affect the skin a little bit, but just subtly. Okay, so here's what we have so far. I do wish that we had a little bit more just blue presence. It still feels like we have some greenish and, magenta-ish deviation here. And that's okay because we have a split complementary, but we can consolidate a little bit further via the blacks. So let's go ahead and add some blue into the blacks. And that's going to tint a whole lot of these flowers. So maybe we'll just go -5. The blacks always need to be a little subtle. We can also add a little bit of cyan and a little bit of magenta. As before and after. And then we can also think about whether or not we want to tint the whites. So maybe we want to go warm on the whites because we went cool on the blacks. To go warm, so kind of orangey, we would want to do red plus yellow. So let's add some red around here. And then also some yellow. And that'll give us a really nice sort of warm golden sky. Okay, before and after. And that is our split complementary look. I'm gonna go ahead and export that and see how we did. Okay, I'm gonna drag and drop in that image and again, try to select as many hues as possible. And that is as close to a split complementary as we can get. That's almost perfectly complementary. Really nice, well consolidated. Okay, I'm gonna bring through one more palette as an additional example. So let's take one more look at our original color wheel and see what else we can consolidate it to. You'll kind of see that 4 of our 5 main hues are on one side of the color wheel. So what we could create is something analogous. We can try to eliminate this, this one outlier, just kind of scoot that over there somehow, and then maybe scoot in our blues into greens and just try to create something that is generally analogous surrounding the greens. Greens are a little bit difficult to work with, not my favorite color, but I think I'm just going to try to work with something that's sort of subtle and desaturated and try to give it sort of a vintage warm look. So let's see how that goes. Once again, I'll start with a new selective color layer and start from the bottom in the magentas. The very little magenta that's in frame, I'm just going to try to desaturate by adding green. Next up, we'll have the blue, and we're going to try to desaturate this and push it towards green. Maybe give it a little bit of depth. Desaturate this way, okay. Next up, we have these cyans, pretty much the same thing. Desaturate it via the red, bring in some green, some more yellow, and yeah, maybe add some additional depth via that black. So far, so good. Already brought the dress really close to the color of these surrounding greens. I don't think we have to do a lot with the greens. I mean, I think we can push them a little bit towards yellow for any of the bluer greens. That's all right. We could add a little bit of green saturation, maybe just a bit. So here's the before and after so far. Next up, let's take a look at the yellow. We can saturate the yellow further, just make it more yellow, and maybe compensate with a little bit of red. And lastly, let's take a look at the red. Let's try to bring in our red a little bit closer to our yellows. So add some yellow, add some green, push in that direction, and maybe add some red back in. Okay, that's the before and the after, and we've really consolidated these colors. Let's bring that mask back in because we're not trying to make her lips yellow. And here's the before and the after with that masked. She still blends in, but if she didn't look natural in her environment, then, we could bring down the density further, and that would help, the color from the background transfer onto her a little bit, just so that she blends into the environment. In this case, I'll leave it right around 80. Okay, let's see if we want to add any black or white tint for this one. Our options include any of those warm colors around green, so anything like green, brown, orange, and so on. Let's start by adding some yellow, warm the shadows up a little bit, and then maybe compensate with some red, bring it closer to orange instead of just pure yellow. And lastly, we can also see if we want to deepen the shadows a little, maybe like a +5. Okay, before and after. Lastly, the whites. Since we went pretty orange on the shadows, for some contrast, I'm going to bring the whites a little closer to green. So maybe a little bit of added green and a little bit of added yellow. Cool. That's the before and the after, and so we've created a really stylized, analogous palette here. Okay, let's take a look at that in Adobe Color. And that's actually a really good hue distribution. We have pretty much everything included there. It's the same color in the sky versus the dress. Okay, so far so good. Let's take a look. And that is a wonderful analogous palette. We've really consolidated all the hues to one half of the color spectrum, or even kind of almost a third. So that's great. Okay, so that concludes how to assess and work with available colors in an image. Here we worked with a very colorful image and we created 3 entirely different palettes, each just with 1 adjustment layer. These can definitely be refined further with more adjustment layers, but this is a great base for each of these palettes. So we worked with a hue input-based tool here because we had a lot of hues available. What if we're working with an image where there's not a lot of color present in the base? So here I've just obviously desaturated the image, but imagine if you have a raw file that just doesn't have a lot of color in it. Well, we wouldn't want to work with a hue input-based tool because we don't have any hues to move around. So instead we want to work with a Luma input-based tool if we want to implement a color harmony here. We can work with any of the Luma input-based tools mentioned previously, such as the gradient map, the curves, the color balance, or even the whites, neutrals, and blacks in the selective color. For the sake of keeping consistent with working with selective color in this section, that's what I'm going to do. So in this case, I'm just going to target the whites and the blacks, and I'm really just going to go for some complementary colors. So for example, if I wanted to push my blacks towards magenta, then I could push my whites towards green. This is an example of a super quick and easy color implementation via a Luma input-based tool. Again, the same thing could be done with any of those other Luma input-based tools. So quite obviously, working with an image that doesn't have a lot of colors present is much less of a headache because we don't have to worry about consolidating colors. All we have to worry about is tinting a certain tonal range, and or if we want to add any secondary color, then, we could try to tint a certain element or something like that. Either way, the tools we can use and the actions we can take are highly contingent on what the raw image has available for us.